Getting buy-in for your villain in your campaign is difficult to say the least, but it shouldn't have to be. There's a lot of different things you can do to gain that investment from your players, but the important thing that you have to do is keep it in mind beforehand. Nothing is worse than dropping a villain in front of everybody, and they have no clue who they are, have no care about them, and just see them as a bunch of hit points. So let's talk about how to change that. When it comes to getting buy-in for your villain, there are a ton of different ways that you can do it, and a ton of different ways that you can combine them all together to create the ultimate villain. But the problem is it's really difficult to do those things if you're not prepared for it ahead of time. See, here's the deal. When players are faced with the giant villain, they want that villain to mean something to their character, the backstory, and the story as a whole. And that's true for anything that you watch, or books, movies, TV shows, whatever. Anything that you're watching, you do want that to be an important through line. But it's so difficult to do in D&D because you don't plan the story. The story is improvised for the most part. You can try and direct it, that's the job of the Dungeon Master, but getting the players to actually focus on it is near impossible. But you don't necessarily have to have them focus on it. You can put it in front of them and let them decide how it feels. Let me give you a few examples. Number one is the fact that your villain should have gravitas in the world. See, when you're looking at things and considering how a villain is important to a story, you have to consider how much influence they have over the world. Are they somebody who is massively powerful, like a dictator or a evil king who is ruling over the land with an iron fist? Well then, everybody's going to be able to see that, no matter where they are. Anywhere you go, you will hear about the horrible things that this king is doing or the horrible effects that his actions have taken on the common people. And since your players typically will start at lower levels, you'll see that from the ground up. They'll start seeing peasants living in squalor, and whenever they ask about where they can get food, they'll find it's almost impossible because the upper hierarchy has determined that they are not worthy of that food. And as they continue to level up and they continue to gain some sort of influence over the world, they'll begin to see that the politicians are corrupt, the guard are corrupt, and eventually they'll be able to pinpoint the source, the king himself. All the way through the campaign, you will have seen him as the villain, even if the actual adventure has nothing to do with him. The players will be going along, and every adventure that they do will have something to do with the king, but it is not focused on him. They then have to go slay a dragon to get the gold in order to be able to help a city that has been living in squalor. Okay, that has nothing to do with the king, but you do know that the king was the cause of it. So on, so on, so on. So one of the most important things you could do is make sure they have influence over the world. But sometimes your villain is not somebody quite that powerful or in the forefront of the story, and that's okay. There are other ways you can do it. Like so. So let's say your villain isn't actually that important to the world around them, or maybe they're more in the shadows. The point is, they're not going to be something that is directly involved in the campaign necessarily, at least not in the forefront. So what do? Say they're a shadowy influencer who's manipulating things behind the scene, or a lich who is slowly gaining power to come back to life, or a god who is trying to return to the material plane. The point is, they're not going to be obvious until the last leg of the campaign. So how do you gain investment for them? Well, there's a few different things that you can do. One is put a bunch of very particular through points that begin to come together. A web of lies that continues to develop and bring the party to paying attention to it. Every adventure they go on, there seems to be one connecting point. There seems to be a particular name that sticks out, or an MO that they're beginning to develop and notice. Or say it's this god who's trying to come back. Take a bunch of different adventures, but all throughout them, you notice that they're all leading towards a particular cult, or a particular certain area that the party can then focus on. These things will cause them to realize that something is in the background, even if they don't realize what it is, and they begin to grow curious. And because it directly is involved with what they've been doing, they naturally have investment because it is what their characters have had to deal with this entire time. This leads to a much more interesting development where they have to figure out a mystery, and it gains investment because they want to know the answers. The other thing that you can do is directly tie the villain into everybody's backstories, which I think is something that becomes much more obvious and something that is a lot more common than the rest of these things I'm talking about. Because the thing is if you're tying the villain directly into people's backstories, say somebody has some sort of mysterious individual in their backstory that is not named but is given to you to be able to use, obviously you can then use that as one of the main villains. The risk that you run with this is two different things, however. One, you risk tying it into only one of the backstories, which then causes everybody to feel a little left out. One player character is naturally going to have more investment than the rest. And you can develop this to work out, but it is much more difficult and you have to be careful with it. The other main risk that you may end up having is you ultimately have the villain tied into too many people's backstories, and it begins to feel more contrived and like a coincidence rather than somebody who is a master manipulator who has been developing this from the beginning. Say, for example, you do have that one villain from somebody else's backstory, but as time goes on, all the players begin to realize that this villain has been manipulating their backstories one by one without them realizing it. That's cool, it can be a cool reveal, but it can also be confusing. I mean, the villain didn't know that this party was going to come together, so why was he causing all these problems beforehand? And unless you have a specific reason for this, it can be very contrived and very confusing, so avoid it unless you really know what you want to do with that. You do, Justin? Okay. And the last thing you need to worry about with the backstory involved villain is very specifically making sure that you are not weaponizing the player characters' backstories unless that is something they have explicitly said that they are okay with or even looking forward to. Because one of the things that is very dangerous with using the backstories as a weapon against the player characters is it makes the players specifically feel like you might be out to get them as the DM. See, if they have all these ties in their backstory to family and friends and people they love, and you use that to constantly attack them, it teaches them to no longer lead to having their player characters have those important ties. And if they don't have those ties, they very quickly become either murder hobos or generic edgy characters, and you don't want that. So if you're going to use this, make sure it is the type of game and villain that your players would be invested in. Otherwise, it can very quickly become a problem. But that's only one of a few different ways to create villains and create investment. There are a few much less traditional ways, which I think could be very interesting. So let's get to those. See, there are a lot of very interesting things that you can do to bring the villain to life that aren't necessarily directly tied into the story of the campaign, but instead techniques. For example, Abria Iyengar has a very interesting way of introducing villains by, at the end of sessions, giving players a sneak peek into what they're doing. What she does is essentially gives a cutscene of some sort, where you can see what the villain's doing, where the player characters would have no idea what's happening. This is a very interesting way of doing it because it allows you to not necessarily have to have the villain directly involved in the campaign at first, but still begin to get player buy-in, even if the character buy-in is not there yet. This is not something to do for every game, but I do think it is fascinating and could be used to great effect if you have the right group for it. Another thing that you could do is basically make sure that the villain shows up in the campaign regularly. Now, this could be as a friendly NPC that eventually is revealed to be the big bad guy, although you have to put in the correct amount of foreshadowing for that, or it will feel cheap. And if you do that, you have to accept that the players may put the pieces together beforehand. And that's okay. It means you did a good job dropping those clues and hints. The other thing that you can do is make sure when you are talking about your villain and introducing them in the campaign, they are there as an antagonistic force, but it is a force that the players cannot fight yet. It is either somebody who cannot be touched politically, because if they do so, they'll create a massive war, or it is somebody who is literally too powerful to fight. Be careful doing this, because it could lead to two things. One, your player characters choosing to fight them anyways, and through some miracle of the dice, killing them, or the BBG just simply TPKs them because they refuse to run away. Don't forget, player characters essentially never run away, unless you have one of my groups. They run away frequently. That being said, it is very interesting to use that and make sure that it is an interesting player in the story by having them actively be involved and fighting against the party. But if you do this, make sure the villain has an out, and don't cheat your players if they manage to defeat the villain. It is totally okay to have your BBG go out by the wayside, defeated in an incredible move, and now you have a totally different story to tell with a new villain that will fill that power vacuum in one way or another. But it is fun to have them continue to be involved in the campaign in a very direct and active way. And the last thing that you can do to make sure that your villain is really active in the campaign and is in front of the player characters and is known is make sure that there are many stories, tales, and legends about them, but have the party learn about them through that, knowing one day they will have to face against this individual. This leads to a very fun dynamic where the players know a ton about them, but the BBG knows nothing about the party. And that can actually be very fun because it swaps the dynamic that is usually there. Usually the BBG knows much about the party and the party knows little about them. So swapping it can be a very interesting thing with a party that appeals to the BBG's backstory and maybe can create a much more diverse and dynamic narrative. But doing all those things should be able to create a much more interesting BBG at your table. So go out into the world and make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day and never forget.
This video wouldn't be possible without the incredible beautiful bastards over on our Patreon. I'd like to give an additional very personal thank you to the Divine Bastards Big D the Cool Guy, BKBW, Clark Smith, Diet Blue, Duplicolor, Manifestering, Rocky, Sassy Cat Productions, Sorit, Supreme Court, Talia Martin, Tin Eye, Void Mystic, Volpe Nico, and Zombies for People too. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without you guys, and you mean the absolute world to us. Keep being beautiful, keep being amazing, and as always, make the world your own.